calling? What are you reporting? Hello?
That phone call lasted exactly 14 seconds before the line went dead at 9:18 in the morning on December 1st, 2011. Someone had dialed 911 from inside a quiet home in Deer Park, Washington, but no words were ever spoken to the dispatcher. What happened in that house during those final moments would reveal a level of betrayal so shocking that even seasoned detectives would struggle to comprehend how someone could commit such unthinkable acts against the person they had once promised to love and protect. Before we dive deeper into this chilling case that will leave you questioning how well you really know the people closest to you, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. It helps spread these important stories so more people can hear them and remember the victims whose lives were tragically cut short. It began as an ordinary school day in Deer Park, Washington, a small town where life usually moved at a slower, more predictable pace. Parents gathered at the drop-off lanes, children hurried into classrooms bundled in jackets against the biting cold, and routines played out, as they always had. But for 15-year-old Logan Starbuck, the day started with a creeping sense that something wasn't right. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Logan sent her mother, Shannon Denise Starbuck, a text message asking where she was and who would be picking her and her younger siblings up from school. By 3, Shannon should have been waiting in the pickup line, like she always did, yet her familiar car was missing, and the space where she normally stood was empty. 20 minutes passed before Logan's phone buzzed with a reply. The message, seemingly from her mother, said, "Dad, I have a headache. Stay there." The text suggested that their father, Clay Starbuck, would come instead. Minutes later, another message followed. "Send Marsh a note. Dad will be there in 10 minutes. Marsh was the affectionate nickname Shannon used for her 10-year-old son, Marshall. The words felt casual enough, but what struck Logan as strange was the silence that followed. No one came. Neither Clay nor Shannon appeared at the school. Logan, now increasingly worried, sent more messages to her mother, but they went unanswered. Realizing they couldn't get into their mother's house without a key, Logan called her 21-year-old brother, Austin, who worked at a local glass company. Austin agreed to pick them up and later dropped the children at their father's house, only half a mile away. For the Starbuck family, life had long been divided between two households. After their divorce, the two oldest children, Austin and 18-year-old Blake, chose to live with Clay, while the younger 3, Logan, Serena, and Marshall, stayed full-time with Shannon. Still, Clay remained deeply involved in their lives. He picked the kids up for school every morning, while Shannon usually handled the afternoon routine. That day, however, the system broke down. Earlier that morning, Clay had texted Shannon that his car had quit while warming up in the frigid air. "Car quit, can you take the kids?" he wrote. Shannon responded with a simple K, agreeing to cover for him. She dropped the children off as usual, but from that point on, everything began to unravel. When Austin arrived home after work that evening, Clay asked if he had seen his mother. The younger kids explained how she never came to the school, that instead she had texted saying Clay would pick them up. Yet Clay had not received those texts. In fact, he hadn't even turned his phone on since that morning. And when he finally checked it around 3:37 in the afternoon, he discovered a message from Shannon at 3:17 asking him to pick up the kids because she had just gotten up. At first, Clay wasn't alarmed. He assumed Shannon might have been resting and expected to see her later that night at Blake's basketball game. He even sent her a message at 5:45 saying he and the kids were headed to the gym and offering to meet her at the entrance so she wouldn't need to pay. But when Shannon didn't arrive, and when she didn't call or text, unease began to settle in. After the game, Clay drove the children to Shannon's house to check on her. They found the home dark, the doors locked, and no sign of her inside. Hoping she might simply be out or resting, Clay decided to keep the children with him overnight. But the next day, December 2nd, things only grew more troubling. The children had no clean clothes for school, and still there was no word from their mother. By that evening, Clay was worried enough to send Shannon another message. If he didn't hear back by 7, he would call the police. At the same time, Shannon's mother, Melanie, who lived in Florida, was also trying desperately to reach her daughter. Every call went straight to voicemail, which was already full, and Melanie's unease turned into dread. After confirming that Shannon's siblings hadn't heard from her either, she contacted law enforcement around 5 that evening to request a welfare check. Deputies Jeff Schwaver and Dan Dutton arrived at Shannon's home around 6:15. They knocked, peered through windows, and noticed a freshly delivered package still sitting unopened on the porch. The house appeared quiet and undisturbed. Finding no immediate signs of foul play and lacking grounds for forced entry, the deputies left after about 10 minutes. Later that night, Clay himself called for a welfare check, showing deputies the unanswered texts on his phone. Again, nothing appeared out of place, but beneath the surface, something terrible had already happened. This was the start of a mystery that would pull investigators, friends, and family into a tangled web of secrets, betrayals, and suspicions. To understand the full scope of what unfolded, we have to step back and look at who Shannon Denison really was, the kind of woman she had been, the life she built, and the struggle she endured before everything came crashing down in that cold Washington winter. Shannon Denise Conway was born on April 19, 1969, in Anderson, Indiana. She grew up in a family of faith, raised as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often referred to simply as the Church by those within it. Her parents, Lawrence and Melanie, gave her a childhood steeped in religious structure and community, and she shared that upbringing with her brothers James and Stephen. Life changed when her parents divorced, and while James stayed in Indiana with their father, Shannon moved with her mother and brother Stephen to Florida, where Melanie later married a man named Charles Borzier. This new marriage expanded the family dramatically, as Charles already had 6 children of his own, and together he and Melanie would go on to have another daughter, Amy. Despite the upheaval, Shannon adapted with grace. She became close to her brother Stephen, who often described their bond as inseparable, more like best friends than siblings. From an early age, she displayed a nurturing, maternal nature, babysitting for neighbors, caring for younger siblings, and always putting others first. Her artistic talents also blossomed during this time. She became known in her community and at school for her exceptional drawing abilities, often winning awards for her work. As a teenager in Florida, Shannon thrived in both academics and social activities. She attended Lake Mary High School, where she participated in band, the Future Business Leaders of America, and served as historian for the Tri-High Club, a service and leadership group. She was not someone who sought the spotlight. Soft-spoken, gentle, content to listen more than she spoke. But her smile, her wit, and her quiet warmth made her a beloved presence among friends. She loved spending weekends at the beach, trips to Disney World, and gatherings with her church community. After graduating in 1987, Shannon attended Florida State University and later Seminole College, where she earned an associate degree in art therapy on a scholarship. Though reserved by nature, she had a drive to learn, to care, and to contribute meaningfully to the lives of others. That instinct would define much of her adult life. In 1980, when she was 20 years old, Shannon's path crossed that of a man who would forever alter the course of her life, Clay Dwayne Starbucks. The two met at a church dance while Clay was visiting South Florida. Clay had grown up in Oregon and Alaska, the son of a law enforcement officer, and by then he was working in the oil industry on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. He was older than Shannon by 5 years, and he had already been married once with 2 children from that previous relationship. Yet the connection between them was quick, even whirlwind, and within a year they were married in Florida on June 1, 1990. The early years of their marriage were marked by change and adaptation. Clay's job took them to Valdez, Alaska, far from Shannon's family and familiar life in Florida. The move was daunting. A harsh climate, long stretches of isolation while Clay worked weeks at a time on the pipeline, and the challenge of suddenly becoming stepmother to his 2 children. But Shannon embraced it. She committed herself to building a home, loving her stepchildren as her own, and eventually raising a family with Clay. In 1990, she gave birth to her first child with Clay, a son named Austin, followed a few years later by another son, Blake. Then came their first daughter, Logan, in 1996, who was later diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Though raising a child with special needs added more complexity to her life, Shannon approached it with patience and fierce devotion. She advocated for Logan, protected her, and worked tirelessly to make sure her daughter never felt limited. Another daughter, Serena, followed, and then in 2001, Shannon gave birth to her youngest, Marshall. Family became her entire world. Shannon was a stay-at-home mother, but that title hardly captured the scope of what she did. She immersed herself in her children's schools, church activities, and sports. She was the mom who cheered the loudest at games, who volunteered at events, who made sure every holiday was special. Beyond that, she had a gift for creating. She quilted, sewed, and cooked, so well, in fact, that her handmade quilts sold for up to $1,000 at craft fairs, and she became the go-to seamstress for everything from prom dresses to baseball caps. But while Shannon poured herself into her family, cracks had already begun to form in her marriage. Clay was away for weeks at a time with pipeline work, and during those absences, temptations surfaced. Shannon discovered his infidelity, and deeper than that, she felt an ongoing tension around faith. She remained devout in her church commitments, while Clay showed no interest in joining, creating a spiritual divide that grew harder to bridge. By March 2000, after a decade of marriage, Shannon and Clay divorced for the first time. Yet the bond between them was complicated, and despite the betrayal and pain, they found their way back together within months. Shannon returned to Alaska, they reunited, and in December 2006, they even remarried, determined to rebuild what had once brought them together. For a time, it seemed they had succeeded. In 2008, they moved to Deer Park, Washington, a close-knit community north of Spokane. Shannon loved the area, its slower pace, and the strong sense of neighborhood. They settled into a rental home at 509 North Ripper Street, and she envisioned a stable, nurturing environment for her children to grow up in. But the second chance at marriage eventually faltered. Long separations due to Clay's work resumed. Trust issues resurfaced, and financial strains piled on. By June 2010, they separated again, and in July, Shannon filed for divorce for the second time. This time, she was determined to move forward on her own. She was awarded custody of the 3 youngest children, while the 2 oldest, Austin and Blake, chose to live with their father. The divorce was messy and bitter. Shannon accused Clay of monitoring her, even breaking into her home and installing spyware on her computer to track her activity. She confided in friends, in instructors, and even in her mother that she feared him. Court records show she sought protection orders alleging harassment, and in October 2011, just weeks before her death, Clay was ordered to pay over $9,000 in back child support and legal fees. The resentment between them was no longer subtle. It was open and consuming. At the same time, Shannon was working to rebuild her independence. after nearly 20 years as a stay-at-home mom, she enrolled in Spokane Community College's dental hygienist program. She excelled, graduating with honors in the summer of 2011, and her classmates described her as maternal, supportive, always the one to organize study sessions. Yet financially, life was difficult. Her car was repossessed, she relied on food banks, and she leaned heavily on friends in her church community for help with the children when classes or obligations kept her late. Still, she pressed forward, determined to create a new life. And in that spirit of starting over, she cautiously stepped into online dating. Friends encouraged her, reminding her she deserved happiness. After years of sacrifice, she joined sites like Plenty of Fish, where she described herself as someone who loved autumn and hoped to find a partner who was tall, educated, and had a good sense of humor. But online dating carried risks. Behind polished photos and charming messages, strangers could conceal darker realities. Shannon had no way of knowing that her openness to finding companionship in this new chapter of her life would place her on a collision course with betrayal and violence that would ultimately claim her life. It wasn't until December 3rd, 2 days after anyone had last heard from her, that deputies returned with the landlord's permission to open the door. Inside, the house was quiet. The living room was neat, her laptop closed, her car parked safely in the garage. Nothing looked out of place until they entered the master bedroom. There on the bed lay the body of 42-year-old Shannon Starbuck. She was partially unclothed, posed in a grotesque and humiliating manner. Bruises covered her body, her robe was pulled open, her legs spread, and sex devices had been deliberately placed on and inside her in a way that seemed less about the act of killing and more about degrading her in death.
The scene left even veteran detectives shaken. Detective Mike Ricketts, assigned lead investigator, later described the discovery as one of the most disturbing he had ever encountered. It was immediately clear this was not just a homicide. It was a killing carried out with rage, obsession, and the intent to send a message. Forensic teams began methodically collecting evidence. More than 100 photographs were taken. They lifted fingerprints from bathroom mirrors, faucets, a dryer, and even a notebook. They swabbed surfaces, drains, computer keyboards, and gathered sheets, towels, and clothing. DNA would later become the linchpin of this case. But at that moment, the sheer brutality of the scene overshadowed everything. Whoever had killed Shannon hadn't simply taken her life. They had staged her body as if to tell a story. And one detail stood out above all others. Investigators would later learn that just hours before her death, Shannon had been texting flirtatiously with a man she had met online, Tom Walker. He had requested she pose for a provocative photo with a sex toy in a very specific way. She had never sent the picture. Yet, when detectives found her body, she had been positioned almost exactly as described in Tom's text message. That chilling connection put Tom Walker at the top of the suspect list. Detectives called him in immediately. Tom explained that he and Shannon had met weeks earlier and exchanged frequent, often sexually charged messages. They had gone on a few dates, enjoyed each other's company, and even arranged another dinner together. But he insisted he had nothing to do with her death. On the day she was killed, he had been at work, attending a funeral during the morning hours, and his movements were corroborated by co-workers and cell phone records. His alibi checked out, and while investigators couldn't ignore the eerie similarity between his request and the way Shannon was found, they began to believe that similarity was no coincidence. Instead, it might have been a deliberate attempt by the killer to frame Tom. Attention then turned to another man in Shannon's life, someone who had gone by the name John Wilson. His online profile featured the photo of a doctor from New York who had no idea his image was being used. In reality, John was a local man named John Kenline, a married high school teacher who had been carrying on a secret affair with Shannon. He used payphones to contact her,
and public computers to send messages, going to great lengths to conceal his identity. When investigators confronted him, John admitted to seeing Shannon multiple times, including on the very morning of December 1st. He even returned to her home several times that day when she didn't answer, peering through windows trying to figure out where she had gone. His behavior was suspicious, but his timeline included trips to Starbucks, the library, and errands that were corroborated with receipts and witnesses. Forensics eventually cleared him as well. At this point, investigators faced a troubling dilemma. The two men who seemed most suspicious both had alibis. Meanwhile, DNA collected from the scene was still being processed, and the killer had a 2-day head start before Shannon's body was even discovered. Then came the breakthrough. Detectives reviewing her phone records noticed something odd. At 9:18 on the morning of December 1st, a call had been placed from Shannon's phone to 911. The call lasted just 14 seconds. On the recording, dispatchers could hear only a faint sound, a high-pitched grunt, followed by rustling, and then silence before the line went dead. Crucially, the record of that call had been deleted from her phone. Whoever killed her had tried to erase it. But the dispatcher's log still had the entry, and GPS coordinates confirmed the call originated from inside Shannon's home. This revelation shifted the entire investigation. It meant that Shannon was attacked shortly after returning from dropping her children at school. It meant she was still alive, fighting, when she made that desperate call. And it meant that every text message sent from her phone after 9:18 that morning was not written by her, but by her killer. Someone close enough to know family nicknames and routines. Someone trying to create the illusion she was still alive. The chilling reality was becoming clearer. This was not the work of a random stranger met online. It was the work of someone who knew her. Someone who knew her children, and someone determined to mislead investigators. As detectives dug deeper, one name kept circling back: Clay Starbucks. From the moment Shannon's body was discovered, Clay Starbucks had made himself visible. He spoke often to detectives, provided phone records, and volunteered details about her online dating life. At first, his cooperation seemed helpful. But soon, investigators noticed that his eagerness to paint Shannon in a negative light was unusual, even unsettling. Friends, neighbors, and members of Shannon's church began coming forward with stories that deepened detectives' suspicions. Several said Shannon had confided in them that she feared Clay, that he would not let go of their broken marriage, and that his behavior had turned increasingly hostile after their second divorce. She told her closest friends that if anything ever happened to her, authorities should look at Clay first. Her personal diary confirmed those fears. In entry after entry, Shannon wrote about feeling unsafe in her own home. She described coming back to find light bulbs unscrewed, her barbecue tipped over, jewelry missing, and even her locks tampered with. She worried that Clay was entering her house when she wasn't there, which is why she eventually changed the locks and refused to give spare keys to anyone, even her children. One particularly disturbing incident involved her discovering a sex toy left on her porch inside a gift bag, accompanied by a note she believed came from Clay. The message read, "If I can't have you, you can have this." These were not the actions of a man content to move on with his life. They were the actions of someone still obsessed. Shannon had also filed multiple reports with deputies in the months leading up to her death. She told them about her fears, her missing belongings, and her suspicion that Clay had installed spyware on her computer to track her every activity and conversations. Detectives later confirmed this. A keystroke logging program had indeed been placed on her laptop, allowing someone to monitor her online activity and conversations. Meanwhile, Clay's own words raised red flags.
He spoke at length to investigators about Shannon's supposed promiscuity, claiming she left their children alone to meet men she had met online, and even showing their young son Marshall nude pictures he alleged were of Shannon. According to Shannon's diary, this devastated her. Marshall came home one day saying, "I don't like you. Everything is your fault because you're divorcing Dad." For Shannon, it was clear evidence that Clay was turning the children against her. Detectives now had motive: resentment, jealousy, financial stress from back child support, and a deep desire to control Shannon even after their marriage had ended. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. They needed hard evidence. That came with the DNA samples collected from Shannon's body, including swabs from her neck and under her fingernails, revealed profiles from 2 male contributors. One was unknown, but the other was consistent with the paternal line of Clay Starbuck. This testing, known as YSTR analysis, could not pinpoint Clay as the sole contributor, but it did link the DNA to him or his direct male relatives. Investigators quickly ruled out his sons, Austin and Blake, who had solid alibis that placed them at work and school the day of the murder. That left Clay as the only viable match. Even more troubling was where the DNA was found. It was present on areas of Shannon's body that suggested direct physical struggle: her neck, her face, and under her nails. This wasn't the kind of DNA you would expect to linger from years of co-parenting or casual contact. This was fresh, placed there during a violent confrontation. When investigators confronted Clay, his explanations were inconsistent. He claimed his DNA might have been present because he used to live in the house or because he and Shannon had been intimate after their divorce, but he could not explain why it would be under her fingernails, the classic sign of a victim scratching their attacker while fighting for their life. At the same time, his alibi began to collapse. Clay insisted that his car had broken down on the morning of December 1st, stranding him close to his home. He said he spent the day napping, playing video games, and tinkering with the vehicle, yet surveillance footage from nearby cameras failed to show him walking the route he claimed he had taken to and from the car. Even more suspicious, his phone records showed that his device had been switched off from just after 8 in the morning until 3:37 the afternoon, the precise window during which Shannon was attacked and killed. Detectives asked themselves a simple question: who turns off their phone for nearly 7 hours on a day when their ex-wife is later found murdered? By early February 2012, investigators were convinced they had their man. On February 6th, Clay Starbuck was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and burglary. He maintained his innocence, insisting that Shannon had been killed by one of the many men she met online, but the growing mountain of evidence pointed squarely at him. Still, this was only the beginning. For the case to move forward, prosecutors needed to lay out a narrative that would persuade a jury beyond reasonable doubt. And that meant piecing together not only the forensics, but the full picture of Clay and Shannon's troubled relationship. The love story that had turned into a nightmare of control, jealousy, and ultimately, murder. When Clay walked into court in May 2013, the room carried a heavy silence. On one side sat Shannon's mother and siblings, determined to see justice served. On the other side were his children, still standing by their father. It was a tragic reminder of how deep the fractures in this family had become. The prosecution laid out their theory carefully. They argued that Clay, angry over child support, jealous of Shannon's dating life, and unwilling to let her move on, plotted her death. They said he staged car trouble on the morning of December 1st, slipped into Shannon's house after she left to take the children to school, and attacked her when she returned. They emphasized the chilling detail that Shannon had managed to dial 911 at 9:18 a.m., only to fall silent as she fought for her life. Forensic experts testified that Shannon's body bore dozens of injuries, signs of a violent struggle. DNA swabs from her neck, face, and fingernails matched Clay's paternal line, and his 2 oldest sons were eliminated by alibis, leaving him as the likely source. Prosecutors also brought forward Shannon's diary entries and testimony from friends and neighbors, where she expressed fear of Clay and suspicion that he was tampering with her home. They showed how Clay had repeatedly spoken ill of Shannon to others, painting her as reckless and promiscuous, almost as if he was preparing the ground for an explanation of what he might do. The defense countered by highlighting the flaws in the investigation. They reminded the jury of the men Shannon had met online, some of whom had suspicious behavior, and insisted that police had zeroed in on Clay too quickly. They attacked the DNA evidence as inconclusive and criticized law enforcement for failing to test every piece of potential evidence. Clay himself denied harming Shannon, saying his DNA could have remained in the home from years of living there and from contact with their children. He insisted the true killer was one of the men Shannon met through online dating. The emotional heart of the trial came when the children testified. The older boys defended their father, describing him as loving and incapable of violence, while Shannon's family and close friends painted a very different picture, recalling her repeated warnings that if anything happened to her, Clay should be the first suspect. Watching her children take sides against her memory was agonizing for Shannon's mother, Melanie, who sat through every word of the trial. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. It didn't take long. On May 28, 2013, Clay Starbuck was found guilty of aggravated first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Shannon's family, it was the justice they had been waiting for, though it came with the unshakable ache of knowing she was gone forever. For Clay's children, it felt like another devastating loss. But the tragedy did not end there. The years that followed saw bitter public arguments between Shannon's relatives and Clay's supporters, often spilling out onto social media. His children continued to believe in his innocence, visiting him in prison and speaking out on his behalf. Shannon's family, meanwhile, tried to preserve her memory and highlight the fears she had expressed in her final months. Then came another heartbreak. In December 2021, Shannon's child, Logan, who had been just 15 when his mother was killed, went missing. Weeks later, his body was found in the Spokane River. Authorities ruled his death assumed. It was a devastating reminder of the long shadow cast by Shannon's murder, a pain that reached far beyond the courtroom and into the lives of her surviving children. Now, the shocking act of a wife's murder wasn't an isolated story. In another disturbing case, we turn to Robert Lemming, where once again, a woman's life was taken in cold blood.
You were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide investigation. You still are. What are your thoughts about that, and what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head?
It's very stressful, but I hope they will be found, and I hope we can move forward from this. A face that looks innocent, and a body that can't seem to stay still. That was Robert Lemming. At first glance, he appeared harmless, but once you dive into the full context behind that interview, you'll quickly realize he's anything but innocent. In May of 2019, his live-in partner and her young child vanished without a trace for weeks. While Robert was out giving interviews, investigators were working tirelessly to uncover the truth. A face that looks innocent and a body that can't seem to stay still, that was Robert Lemming. At first glance, he appeared harmless, but once you dive into the full context behind that interview, you'll quickly realize he's anything but innocent. In May of 2019, his live-in partner and her young child vanished without a trace for weeks. While Robert was out giving interviews, investigators were working tirelessly to uncover the truth. And what they discovered next will make you question everything you thought you knew. The horrifying details were so chilling and brutal that the case earned him the nickname Canada's Chris Watts. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. To really dive into this story, let's rewind to 2017. That's when Jasmine Levitt and Roby Anderson welcomed their first baby, a daughter named Aaliyah Sanderson. At the time, Jasmine and Roby weren't married, and they were both pretty young. Jasmine was in her early 20s, and by all accounts, she was a strikingly beautiful woman. But as with many relationships, things weren't as perfect as they may have seemed on the outside. After Aaliyah was born, cracks started to show in Jasmine and Roby's relationship. According to reports, Roby began coming home later and later, leaving Jasmine alone with their newborn. Then things took a turn for the worse when he started showing up drunk or high. That behavior only escalated, and soon Robbie was becoming more aggressive. One day, Robbie came home, and things quickly escalated when he aggressively demanded money from Jasmine. She was terrified for her safety and ran into the bathroom to call the police. By the time the police arrived, Robbie was gone. And since Jasmine hadn't been physically harmed, they told her there wasn't much they could do at that point. However, Jasmine managed to get an emergency protection order against Robbie. But just 13 days later, the order was revoked after Jasmine and Robbie claimed they had worked things out. They told authorities they didn't need the order anymore, though the details of what happened between them during that time remain unclear. What we do know for sure is that Jasmine and Robbie eventually split up, and Jasmine got custody of Aaliyah. After the breakup, Jasmine and Robbie managed to keep things relatively civil. They focused on co-parenting and tried their best to maintain a peaceful environment for their daughter despite the challenges of their past. Keep in mind that this all took place in 2018, and during all the emotional turmoil, Jasmine found solace in her family, whom she was very close to. Reports mention that Jasmine was especially close to her mom and sister. They often gathered for family dinners, and she kept them updated on everything happening in her life. After months of navigating heartbreak, Jasmine decided it was time to start putting herself out there again. So she joined a few dating sites in hopes of meeting someone new. And it wasn't long before Jasmine met Robert Leeming, a man who seemed to meet her high standards. At the time they met, Robert was 34 years old, about 10 years older than Jasmine, who was in her mid-20s. While the age gap wasn't huge, it was still noticeable. Robert was originally from the United Kingdom, but had moved around a lot as a child due to his father's military career. This constant moving made it hard for him to form lasting friendships, an issue that continued into his adult life. Despite his struggles with socializing, Robert found a way to connect with others online where he felt more comfortable. He loved chatting in online forums and meeting people without the pressure of face-to-face interaction. It was actually in one of these chat rooms that he met his first wife, a Canadian woman who was studying to become a teacher. They married in 2013, and Robert moved to Canada to be with her. They had a son together, but unfortunately the marriage didn't last, and by 2017 they had separated. Robert's ex-wife received full custody of their son, with Robert only having supervised visitation. Although Robert and his ex-wife were no longer together, Robert stayed in Canada thanks to his permanent residency status, which he had earned through his job as a heavy goods vehicle mechanic. After his marriage ended, Robert, like Jasmine, turned to dating sites where he dated several women before finally meeting Jasmine. Now, their whirlwind relationship began in September of 2018, and just a month later, Jasmine and her young daughter Aaliyah were moving into Robert's home. It was a bold step, one that raised eyebrows, especially with a child in the mix. Moving in after only 1 month of dating is fast by most standards, but for them, it seemed like the logical choice at the time. Financially, it made sense. Sharing a home meant cutting costs in half, something many people can appreciate in today's economy. Unlike a roommate setup, living with a partner offers more than just a practical split of rent. There's someone to help with groceries, chores, and in Jasmine's case, childcare. With no job at the time, Jasmine relied on child support from her ex while dedicating herself to raising Aaliyah. Having Robert step in to help with Aaliyah must have been a welcome relief. And help he did. Robert was more than eager to pitch in. Whether it was cooking, cleaning, or watching Aaliyah while Jasmine ran errands, he seemed to embrace his new role wholeheartedly. His love for Aaliyah was obvious. He treated her like his own. And for Jasmine, that made all the difference. From the outside, things looked perfect. Jasmine's family thought so too. She remained close to her mom and sister, Janavi, frequently meeting them for family dinners. When Robert began joining these gatherings, her family welcomed him. He seemed kind, attentive, and genuinely invested in Jasmine and Aaliyah. but not everyone was entirely on board. Genevieve, always protective of her sister, couldn't shake her unease. The relationship was moving too fast for her liking, and while Robert's care for Aaliyah and Jasmine was clear, Genevieve couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then came April 14, 2019, a family dinner like any other. Jasmine, Robert, and Aaliyah joined the usual gathering. But this time, something was off. Genevieve couldn't help but notice that Jasmine and Robert seemed distant, a little more reserved than usual. It was subtle, but enough to make her wonder. Still, the dinner ended without incident, and the sisters even made plans to meet again on Good Friday, April 19th. But when the day came, Jasmine never showed up. No call, no text, nothing. This was completely out of character. Jasmine was someone who always kept her commitments, especially with family. Genevieve's worry grew with every unanswered call and text. She even tried messaging Jasmine on Facebook, but her messages weren't just ignored, they were marked undelivered. Unable to shake her concern, Genevieve drove to Jasmine and Robert's house that evening around 5 p.m. The basement light was on, a sign that someone had to be home. She knocked on the door.
What happened next was strange and unsettling. The officers knocked on the door, but no one answered. They knocked again and again. It was like a game of Groundhog Day. Repeated knocks, but still no response. Then the officers noticed something strange. The note that Jasmine's mother had left on the door just days earlier was still there. It was almost as if it had been waiting for them. But that wasn't the only odd detail. The front door's window, which had previously been clear, was now covered with something that looked like cellophane, the kind of clear plastic used to wrap gifts. It was the only window on the door that was covered, and it completely obstructed the view into the house. This made it impossible to see what was happening inside. The officers kept knocking, rang the doorbell, and waited. The atmosphere was tense, like something was being hidden. While waiting, one officer noticed a wet trunk liner lying over the air conditioner, seemingly drying out. It was obvious the trunk liner had been recently cleaned. In addition, the garden hose had been unwound, which suggested it had been used to rinse something down, likely the trunk liner. This observation immediately brought to mind the sneakers Jasmine's mother had seen earlier, which had been soaked and washed. A lot of signs were pointing to a cleanup, but what was being hidden? Then, as they continued to observe, they realized something. This house hadn't been abandoned. Someone had been there, cleaning and moving things around. The only problem was that the police couldn't get inside just for a welfare check. The locked door and the covered windows left them with no easy way in. But the officers weren't ready to give up. They decided to get creative and called the fire department. With the help of a ladder truck, they managed to peer into the windows of the upper floors, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that could give them more information. Unfortunately, they saw nothing through the windows. But as soon as the fire truck arrived, the lights inside the house flickered on, and moments later, Robert opened the front door. Of course, the officers questioned him, and his response, well, take a look at this. I was sleeping. I sleep with plugs in. And, hey, we've been here for hours and hours and hours now. Hey, banging on your door and bringing the doorbell. I've been drinking and smoking a lot, so, okay, so she's not with her sister? What do you mean? Well, that's the reason that we're here. Why do you think we're here? Is the family's calling us saying, we haven't heard from our daughter and our sister? Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, okay. Why does that make sense? Because I haven't heard from her either. At this point, the officers knew they needed to dig deeper. They asked Robert about Jasmine's car, and he explained that she didn't drive. That seemed odd considering she was a grown adult and should have some means of transportation. They also noticed the note on the door that Jasmine's mother had left behind, but Robert claimed he had no idea about it. The situation was becoming more bizarre with each passing moment. The officers were growing increasingly suspicious of Robert's behavior. His responses were erratic, and his story didn't seem to add up. As they pressed him for more details, it felt like Robert was either hiding something important or just completely out of touch with reality.
So, determined to get to the bottom of things, the officers decided to take a closer look at Robert's past. As it turns out, Robert had a record of emotional abuse in his previous relationship. His ex-wife had reported that he would gaslight her, call her crazy, and emotionally mistreat her. It seemed that Robert's neglect and verbal mistreatment were a big part of what led to their divorce. But it didn't stop there. His ex-wife also reported that Robert had a growing collection of guns and knives, which alarmed her to the point that she feared for her safety and the safety of their child. The officers dug even further into Robert's history and found that his ex had also reported him for animal mistreatment. Apparently, Robert had taken the dog they once owned together to a park, tied it to a tree without food or water, and left it there. Thankfully, someone at the park noticed the dog and brought it to the Humane Society. Now, this was a huge red flag. Anyone who is cruel to an animal is likely to become cruel to humans too. And Robert's actions toward animals raised serious concerns. He was charged with animal abuse and pleaded guilty to 3 charges: causing an animal to be in distress, failing to provide an animal with food and water, and failing to provide an animal with shelter. While he didn't serve jail time, he was slapped with a hefty fine of $5,000 and was banned from owning animals for 10 years. But Robert's troubling history doesn't stop there. During the divorce hearings, Robert's ex-wife uncovered some seriously disturbing stuff. She found some chilling internet searches on Robert's phone. One was about chaining a dog to a tree, which, considering his history, definitely set off alarm bells. But the next search, it was even worse. It was about a mother and child dying in a house fire. Just imagine how terrified his ex must have felt after what he'd already done to that dog. She couldn't help but fear that he might do something much worse to her and her son. With all this terrifying new info about Robert's past, the police decided it was time to get serious. On April 25th, they arrested him in connection with the disappearances of Jasmine and Aaliyah and brought him in for a formal interrogation. When asked about the last time he saw Jasmine and Aaliyah, Robert said that on April 17th they had gone on a picnic at Bragg Creek, about 30 minutes from his home. Afterward, they all returned to the house. According to Robert, Jasmine sat on the couch watching TV while he got ready for a date. Keep in mind, Robert had been telling people that he and Jasmine were just roommates at this point, and he even claimed he'd been seeing another woman for quite some time. Robert went on to say everything seemed perfectly fine with Jasmine before he left for his date, but when he came back that night, Jasmine and Aaliyah were nowhere to be found. This raised some serious red flags for the investigators, especially since Jasmine's family had told them that Robert and Jasmine were in a serious relationship after their breakup. The officers decided to reach out to the woman Robert said he was dating that night, a woman we'll call Kate. When they spoke with her, Kate confirmed she had indeed been with Robert on the night Jasmine and Aaliyah disappeared. The officers dug deeper, asking Kate some follow-up questions. She revealed that she and Robert had met online in February of 2019, roughly 5 months after Jasmine and Aaliyah had moved in with him. They'd gone on some dates, and Robert occasionally stayed at Kate's house. It didn't seem like he was trying to hide the relationship. But here's the kicker. Kate told the police she had never been to Robert's place.
Still nothing. She waited, knocked again, and even tried peeking inside, but the house remained eerily silent. With no way to reach her sister, Genevieve left, hoping she was overthinking things. 2 days later, on April 21st, Jasmine's mother, Kim, decided to visit the house herself. Like Genevieve, she was met with silence. Knocking, ringing the doorbell, it was all futile. But as she prepared to leave, Kim noticed something strange near the front door. 2 pairs of sneakers. One pair was freshly cleaned, still soaking wet, and placed neatly by the entrance. Though her mother hadn't received any response, she left a note on the front door of Jasmine and Robert's home. It was probably a message urging them to get in touch, hoping that either Jasmine or Robert would finally respond. But the days went by and still there was no word from Jasmine.
By April 23rd, 4 days after leaving the note, the family's concern had reached a boiling point. Jasmine had missed several planned check-ins, and on this day she was supposed to meet her mother and sister for another family dinner. This dinner was a long-standing tradition for the family, and missing it was something Jasmine would never do. Despite the growing worry, the family still clung to a small thread of hope. Maybe something had come up, or maybe there was a misunderstanding. But as the hours ticked by and Jasmine didn't show up, that hope began to fade. This was the moment that everything shifted for Genevieve. She was beyond worried. The feeling that something was terribly wrong weighed heavily on her, and she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her gut. So she decided to go to the police station and file a missing persons report. And she was determined to do whatever she could to help find her sister. She handed over her phone, answered every question the police had, and provided a full account of everything she knew about Jasmine's life in recent months. Initially, detectives considered the possibility that Jasmine had left voluntarily. However, Genevieve immediately dismissed the idea. Her sister would never abandon her family, especially not without contacting someone, least of all with her young daughter Aaliyah left behind. Jasmine was deeply devoted to her child and her family. Disappearing without a trace simply wasn't in her character. Investigators also turned their attention to Jasmine's ex, Robbie, wondering if he might be connected to her disappearance. Genevieve clarified that while Robbie was no longer involved in Jasmine's life, he had relinquished his parental rights to Aaliyah, which meant he was no longer obligated to pay child support. While this had added financial strain on Jasmine, there had been no indications of lingering conflict between them. After investigating further, police ruled him out as a suspect. However, when the detectives began looking deeper into Jasmine's relationship with her current partner, Robert, they found themselves uncovering a much more complicated situation than they had initially imagined. So, back in December of 2018, Jasmine had confided in her sister, Genevieve, about the troubles she was facing with Robert. Their relationship was strained, and they had actually broken up. However, they decided to continue living under the same roof as roommates. It was an unusual arrangement, especially considering there's a toddler in the house, but Jasmine explained it as a practical decision. Moving out with a toddler is not only difficult, but also costly. She justified it as a temporary solution, hoping they could figure things out. And just a few weeks later, Jasmine told Genevieve that they had reconciled and decided to give their relationship another shot. However, the troubles didn't end there. Jasmine revealed another personal detail to her sister that added yet another layer of complexity to the situation. During their period of separation, she had become pregnant, but instead of continuing with the pregnancy, Jasmine made the difficult decision to terminate it. The emotional weight of that choice seemed to linger, and it was unclear whether it played a role in their breakup, their reconciliation, or in something deeper that was affecting their relationship. As time went on, financial stress began to build. With Robbie no longer providing child support for Aaliyah, Jasmine found herself carrying the full burden of providing for herself and her daughter. While she hadn't yet secured a job, she was determined to find work. In fact, Jasmine longed to return to the workforce, not just for financial reasons, but also to feel productive and to have more interaction with other adults. She even admitted to feeling jealous when Robert left for work each day, while she stayed behind to care for Aaliyah. Now, Genevieve's account convinced detectives that this was no runaway case. Something else had happened to Jasmine, and the police wasted no time launching a full-scale investigation. Within days, they pieced together a timeline of events leading up to her disappearance. As mentioned earlier, Jasmine and her daughter Aaliyah were last seen at a family dinner on April 14th, and everything seemed perfectly normal. On April 15th, CCTV footage captured them at a local grocery store. Jasmine appeared calm and collected as she paid for her groceries at a self-checkout, with Aaliyah peacefully nestled in her stroller.
The following day, April 16th, was when the first hint of something troubling began to unfold. Robert dropped Aaliyah off at daycare at precisely 7:12 in the morning. Everything appeared fine as usual, but things took a strange twist later in the day. At 4:46 p.m., Robert returned to pick up Aaliyah, but there was a problem. He wasn't on the authorized pickup list. This wasn't a small detail. In order to take Aaliyah home, Robert had to call Jasmine, who then had to personally authorize the daycare staff to release Aaliyah into his care. Now, while this was certainly unusual, it wasn't the most alarming part. What happened after that was Jasmine and Aaliyah would never be seen or heard from again. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Days went by without a trace. Then, on April 18th, an odd clue surfaced. Jasmine's credit card was used to place a food delivery order. But the authorities couldn't confirm whether Jasmine herself had placed the order or if someone else had gained access to her card. But it was clear that whoever had used it was still connected to her in some way. By now, the focus of the investigation had shifted to Robert. After all, he had been the last person seen with both Jasmine and Aaliyah. Genevieve, Jasmine's sister, had already told the authorities about the tension in Jasmine and Robert's relationship, their breakup, their reconciliation, and the strain they were under. This information made Robert an even more important person of interest. It seemed fair to question him, especially considering all the recent turmoil in their relationship. So, on April 24th, the police decided it was time for a welfare check at Robert's home. Every time she asked why, he claimed his room was messy and that he had a roommate. He even referred to Jasmine as his tenant, not his girlfriend. But as strange as all of this was, the police couldn't just jump to conclusions. Even though they were suspicious, they didn't have enough to tie him directly to Jasmine and Aaliyah's disappearance. So Robert was released, but not without a few conditions. His car and phone were seized, and they obtained a search warrant for his townhouse. They told him he couldn't go home until they were done investigating. Over the next few days, the police combed through everything. They looked into Robert's phone data and uncovered that on April 23rd, the day Jasmine and Aaliyah were reported missing, Robert had deleted around 30 photos of the two of them. He'd also deleted some photos of a gun, and to make matters worse, his phone's location data showed he had been in the Bragg Creek area at the time Jasmine and Aaliyah went missing. Remember, he had claimed they went there for a picnic, but the timing was very suspicious. So the police decided they needed to check out this creek area. When they searched it, they discovered a makeshift fire pit that looked freshly used, but not for cooking hot dogs or s'mores. As they examined the area, they found some truly disturbing items: a car seat belt, toddler shoes, diapers, parts of children's books, and a Jungle Book DVD. Scent dogs were brought in, and they alerted to the presence of an accelerant used to start the fire. The investigation didn't stop there. CCTV footage from a local gas station showed Robert filling up his car and a gas can, followed by him going through a car wash. But it was what they found when they searched his home that was even stranger. The front door had been barricaded with 2 long poles, and, as mentioned earlier, the window was covered in cellophane. Multiple spots on the walls had also been sanded down and cleaned. Inside, they found more oddities: a plastic hammer filled with sand, and boxes of blue moving blankets. They also found a gun safe packed with multiple guns and boxes of ammo. But what stood out most was a partially melted firearm part, infant toys, Jasmine's prescription bottles, and even her shredded passport in his trash can. But wait, there was something even stranger. They found raw strips of bacon scattered all over the house, thrown about like it was some sort of bizarre breadcrumb trail. One piece of raw bacon was found draped over a dining room chair, another in the garage, and yet another in the room with the furnace. As if that wasn't strange enough, an empty bacon package was sitting idly in the kitchen. But despite all the bizarre findings, there was still no sign of Jasmine or Aaliyah.
Now, while all of this was unfolding, Robert himself was out there giving interviews, adamantly claiming that he had nothing to do with Jasmine and Elias' disappearance.
You were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide investigation. You still are. What are your thoughts about that, and what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head?
It's very stressful, but I hope they will be found, and I hope we can move forward from this. No, we were friends, absolutely friends, and supported each other. I would like, obviously, for them to be found, and for me to be clear to this.
Your relationship with Jasmine?
Good.
I mean, were you boyfriend, girlfriend, or?
No, just good friends. Nothing alarmed me until, of course, I got arrested.
So what happens with you right now?
I'm just going to wait until I get a phone call to say that I can go home.
How are you feeling throughout all of this?
The officers continued their act, telling Robert crazy stories about how they were part of a criminal group, a gang with a lot of experience in illegal activities. They painted a picture of how bad the police were and how much they could help Robert. They even gave him advice on how to stop the cops from suspecting him, all while playing into his insecurities and fears. Eventually, the officers invited Robert to their so-called warehouse, which they made sound like some kind of secret hideout where they kept all their illegal weapons. Robert, desperate for someone to talk to and willing to take any support he could get, agreed to go with them. When they arrived at the warehouse, the officers showed him a collection of guns, hoping to make Robert believe that they were dangerous criminals. Seeing the weapons seemed to trigger something in Robert. He began to feel like he could trust these people who had been feeding him all these stories. So he started opening up more. He told them that when he and Jasmine were dating, he had cheated on her. He justified it by saying, "Every single guy does that." While this is clearly not true for everyone, it gave the officers even more insight into his mindset and character. According to Robert, Jasmine had wanted to get married, but he didn't, and this caused a lot of tension between them. As the conversation continued, Robert opened up even more. Despite only meeting these two officers 5 hours earlier, he confessed in detail, almost as if he was seeking validation or sympathy. He didn't clearly explain how he had killed Jasmine or her daughter Aaliyah, but he did share disturbing details. After killing them, Robert used his phone to find a remote area to dispose of their bodies. He chose Bragg Creek and drove there to check out the surroundings. He said he waited until the next day to hide the bodies, taking them to the woods near Bragg Creek. Once there, he buried them and drenched them in gasoline. Although he didn't burn their bodies, his hope was that the smell of gasoline would confuse the cadaver dogs and prevent them from finding the remains. Robert's efforts to cover his tracks didn't stop there. He told the officers that he had also set up a makeshift fire pit to burn Jasmine and Aaliyah's personal belongings. Items like Aaliyah's car seat and other possessions were burned, all to make it look like Jasmine had simply taken her child and run away. Robert even went to the extent of covering the bodies in mulch, because he believed the mulch would help mask the scent and confuse the cadaver dogs further. What struck the officers most was Robert's obsession with throwing off the cadaver dogs. He had bacon all over his house, and it wasn't just because he liked the smell of the meat. Robert explained that he had heard pork smells similar to human flesh, so he figured that the bacon would distract the dogs, preventing them from detecting the bodies. His plan seemed well thought out, almost like he had studied how to evade detection. He even commented on his old car, joking that if it had been a newer model, the police could easily track his movements. But since it wasn't, he felt like he had outsmarted them. And get this, Robert agreed to show the officers where he had hidden the bodies. So in the middle of the night, they drove to Bragg Creek, and Robert led them to the exact spot where he had buried Jasmine and Aaliyah's. The bodies were wrapped in blue moving blankets, buried under dirt, sticks, and mulch, not far from the makeshift fire pit.
The fact that Robert brought the officers to the scene was chilling, as it showed just how proud he was of his actions. Many killers return to the scene of their crimes or keep mementos, and Robert seemed to take pleasure in showing off what he had done. The information Robert provided was more than enough for the police to arrest him immediately. The Calgary Police Department held a press conference soon after, but they didn't disclose all the details right away. DNA evidence confirmed the worst. The bodies found were those of Jasmine and her young daughter, Aaliyah. Jasmine had suffered brutal, blunt force trauma to her head, with the added horror of a bullet wound behind her left ear. Aaliyah, too, endured savage blows, one to each side of her head, another to her back, and a spinal injury that made the fall theory impossible. Both deaths were ruled homicides, giving the authorities the green light to pursue murder charges, no longer just manslaughter. On the 7th of May, Robert's fate took a darker turn, as he was officially charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. While the prosecution briefly considered pushing for first-degree murder charges, they ultimately concluded they couldn't prove premeditation, but they were confident second-degree murder would be their focus, and they aimed for a solid conviction. As his trial unfolded in October of 2021, Robert's defense took an unexpected turn. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Jasmine, but insisted almost callously that he had nothing to do with Aaliyah's death. Robert's defense team painted a chilling picture of what they claimed happened on April 17th. They argued that Robert had picked up Aaliyah from daycare and brought her home to an empty house. Jasmine was nowhere to be found. He and Aaliyah played together, watching her favorite show, The Wiggles. At some point, she wandered upstairs toward the kitchen, but tragically, she slipped and fell backward, hitting her head. Robert claimed she got up quickly, appearing fine. So they continued their evening, eating dinner and watching TV. Later, Robert put Aaliyah to bed, went outside to smoke a cigarette, and made himself a drink. Jasmine came home around 7, and at about 9, she went upstairs to check on Aaliyah.
It's very stressful, but I hope they will be found, and I hope we can move forward from this. No, we were friends. Absolutely friends, and supported each other. I would like, obviously, for them to be found, and for me to be cleared of this. Your relationship with Jasmine? Good. I mean, were you a boyfriend, girlfriend, or no? Just good friends. Nothing alarmed me until, of course, I got arrested. So what happens with you right now? I'm just going to wait until I get a phone call to say that I can go home. How are you feeling throughout all of this? Traumatized, of course. Is there anything else that you want to add to all this? Yeah, if anyone sees her or Aaliyah, Jasmine or Aaliyah, please, let the authorities know. They said that they would be done with the property today and that I would be able to go back to the property. But so you're hoping to sleep there tonight? I will sleep somewhere tonight, yes. As you might have seen in the video, Robert appeared to be high or possibly intoxicated. According to him, that had been his life for the past few days. He claimed everyone thought he was a kidnapper or murderer, and as a result he had lost his job. His friends had turned on him, and he had nothing to do but drink every day. He also complained bitterly about the police, saying they had destroyed his house and made a huge mess. Robert insisted that he was innocent and hired a lawyer, convinced that he needed help to prove it. But then someone close to him came forward anonymously, revealing that Robert had a reputation for being a loose cannon and behaving erratically. Investigators believed this new information, as it fit the pattern of strange interactions they'd already had with him. It was yet another piece of the puzzle that made him look increasingly suspicious. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to press charges, so the police decided to try a new strategy. On May 5th, 2 undercover officers approached Robert on the street near his home. Remember, Robert had been talking a lot about how his life was falling apart, how he had lost his job, his friends, and had no one to turn to. It seemed like this was exactly what the police were hoping for, because as soon as the officers started talking to him, Robert began to open up. The undercover officers kept complimenting him and boosting his ego, telling him they believed he was innocent. This flattery seemed to have an impact on Robert, making him more willing to talk to them. At one point during their conversation, the officers even told Robert a false story. They claimed that while the police were investigating his house, one of his neighbors had stolen evidence from the scene and given it to them. This wasn't true at all, but they hoped it would make Robert trust them more. They kept manipulating him by suggesting that he meet them for a beer, where they could talk about destroying the evidence together. Robert, clearly feeling lonely and vulnerable, agreed to meet up with them. But even though he seemed to be opening up, he was still a bit suspicious of the officers. He even asked them multiple times if they were really cops or if they were just trying to trick him. The undercover officers reassured him each time, convincing him that they weren't law enforcement. What she found was every mother's nightmare. Her daughter wasn't breathing and was unresponsive in her bed. According to Robert, Jasmine immediately flew into a rage, accusing him of killing Alea. But that accusation set Robert off. In a fit of anger, he said he grabbed a hammer and struck Jasmine repeatedly until she collapsed. To make sure she was truly dead, he then retrieved a gun and shot her. The story only worsened from there. Robert, in a macabre attempt to cover his tracks, wrapped Jasmine's lifeless body in a blue moving blanket, then used a towel to clean up the blood. He tossed the towels away, made himself another drink, and went to bed. Over the next several days, he buried their bodies and burned anything that might have tied him to the crime. However, the autopsy told a much darker story. The injuries to Alea's head and spinal cord were far more severe than any fall could explain. The evidence was too clear. This wasn't an accident. Additionally, medical examiners claimed that Alea had injuries to her genital area, suggesting possible harm in that part. This revelation led prosecutors to believe that when Jasmine returned home on April 17th, she caught Robert in the act. Fearing that Jasmine might expose what she had discovered, Robert reportedly killed her to silence her. In a panic, he then killed Alea, fabricating the story about her accidental fall down the stairs to cover his tracks. This theory seemed to align with what Jasmine's family had said about Robert's behavior, how he doted on Alea, picking her up, cooking for her, and spending time with her in a way that raised suspicions. Although many might argue that a good step-parent can show care for a child, Robert's excessive interest, especially in light of the medical examiner's findings, seemed more than just ordinary affection. What's particularly striking is that Robert never denied killing Alea during his conversations with undercover cops. Instead, he framed it as an accident. Prosecutors argued that had Alea's death been truly accidental, Robert would have been eager to make that clear, especially considering how horrific the idea of killing a child is in court. They pointed out that Robert never once said that he didn't kill her. Instead, he stuck with the story he had told from the beginning. Robert himself took the stand as the sole witness for his defense, repeating the same account. Alea had fallen down the stairs, hit her head, and died in her sleep. But his excuse didn't hold up, especially when it came to the claim that he couldn't call for help because he couldn't find his phone. In reality, Robert had his phone with him the entire time. Plus, authorities were able to track his text messages, including one sent to his mistress just before the killings. Despite these inconsistencies, Robert waived his right to a jury trial, allowing the judge to decide his fate. The judge found him guilty of second-degree murder in Alea's death, stating that the injuries were not accidental and that Robert had intentionally caused harm. The judge also pointed out that Robert's actions, drinking and smoking after the murders instead of seeking help for Alea, showed a clear lack of remorse. Robert was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Jasmine's family was satisfied with the sentence, though they acknowledged that no amount of time would bring Jasmine and Elia back. The family also found solace in knowing that their loved ones' legacies would live on through their charitable efforts. They raised $25,000 for the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter and started a memorial scholarship in Jasmine's name to help other women who have survived domestic violence. In 2022, Robert appealed his conviction, arguing that the medical examiner couldn't rule out an accidental fall causing Elia's fatal injuries. However, the appeal was rejected, and on July 23, 2024, his conviction was upheld. As for Jasmine and Elia's families, they continued to honor their memories by raising awareness about domestic violence and supporting those affected. But many people felt that the sentence wasn't enough. With only 20 years and the possibility of parole, some believed it was too lenient given the brutal and calculated way he took their lives. It definitely sparked a lot of debate. So, what do you think? Was the punishment fair considering the severity of the crimes, or do you think he deserved a harsher sentence? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so make sure to drop a comment below and let's talk about it. If you like the way we create these videos, and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.